Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to theologian Gary Anderson about the surprising things the biblical tradition has to say about the poor, about charity, and about charity's rewards. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. All right. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording on February 15th, 2022 in central Phoenix, Arizona. And we are speaking with someone whose climatological situation is almost certainly very different than our current 77 or so degrees, because our guest, Dr. Gary Anderson, is coming to us from South Bend, Indiana, my old home territory, where the winds and temperatures and gray skies of mid-February are legendarily penitential, one might say. So we'll distract Professor Anderson from the weather by taking 45 minutes or so of his time to talk about charity in the Jewish and Christian traditions. Dr. Anderson is the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Thought at the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of numerous articles and several very important books, among which are Sin, a History, published by Yale University Press in 2009, and the book I will be talking with him about today, Charity, the Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition, published in 2013 by Yale University Press. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak with Dr. Anderson because his book is one that really challenged and changed my own views about charity and how it fits into my own faith commitments. And I'm also pleased to do so because we have yet to speak with a theologian. The tacit rule in our contemporary public life being that one does not introduce theologians into mixed company. We're going to ignore that rule, however, because it's important that everyone, whatever their faith commitments, understand what charity once was, how it came to be, and how it has changed. And with that, Gary Anderson, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is our great pleasure to have you and to have the chance to learn from you. I know that no one in the world knows more about this topic than you do. And I think it's one that will, the content of what you have to say will probably surprise many of our listeners who don't really know much, as I didn't know much about the real sort of role and concept of charity in the biblical tradition. So let's just jump right in there and see how far we can get in coming to understand how the Bible, or more broadly, the biblical tradition, since we're talking about both the scriptures, Jewish and Christian expressions here, how the Bible understands charity. So in your book, you begin by saying that first we need to understand how to understand sin before we can understand charity, and that the understanding of sin sort of changes as we go through the Old Testament period. Can you walk us through that change, how the understanding of sin changes over the time period covered in the Old Testament, and how sin is related to charity in that way?
Yes, I'd be certainly happy to do that. And I think you're absolutely correct that concepts of sin and concepts of charity work in a kind of amazingly symbiotic fashion, certainly by the time we get to the New Testament. I would just want to introduce just a slight caveat. I think we can appreciate the value of charity apart from the distinctive character of sin. They're not connected necessarily, but they are connected nonetheless, and I think the point that you opened with is certainly accurate. And really, the history that you alluded to is pretty easy to summarize. In the Old Testament itself, that is, the Jewish scriptures, there are a variety of images or metaphors for sin, but the overwhelmingly most common one would be that of a sin as a burden that an individual must carry. And nicely reflected in the Yom Kippur ritual in the book of Leviticus, where the sins of Israel are offloaded onto a pack animal who carries them away. We get this also in the New Testament, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. That's very much the notion of sin as a weight offloaded onto an animal to remove from the human domain. But the image that becomes much more popular at the end of the Old Testament period, and certainly dominant in the New Testament period and the rabbinic period, is that of sin as a debt. And where we can see that most obviously would be in the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, as it's known to Catholics, which, as many people know, should most properly be translated, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive those over whom we hold debts." Of course, it's normally translated trespasses, but the underlying Greek noun there is debt, and the word for forgive is most at home in the notion of forgiving a debt that you have the right to collect. So that's what forgiveness is. Someone owes you something, but a financial sum of some sort, and you choose not to collect. That is forgiveness, forgiving the debts of others. And that becomes certainly one of the most common images in the New Testament, and explains why Jesus talks about debtors and creditors so often in the Gospels. It's not so much his own personal choice to use that image, but it's very much the image of the day, the image of his contemporary, Aramaic and Hebrew language. And the reason why that's related to charity is that charity is understood as a act of human virtue that, among all of its other many benefits, accrues a treasure in heaven. And that's where you might want to say, the compatibility of sin as debt, charitable act comes into play. If when you sin, you create a debit in heaven, when you give to the poor or the undeserving, you are depositing into a treasury in heaven. And you can draw down that treasury, one might want to say, or pay off those debts, you might want to say, would be the better way to put it, by your good actions. And that's certainly why in Christendom, up to the time of the Reformation, acts of charity were so important, especially in penitential seasons like Lent, because they were thought to contribute to your playing your role in the forgiveness of sins.
They sort of lower that side of the ledger, so to speak, acts of charity in heaven. Yeah. If we just stay sort of in the Old Testament for now, before we move forward, where does this sort of concept get most talked about? What are the sort of the books of the Old Testament or passages that people might look up themselves if they're interested?
Well, part of the problem, of course, is not all translations are going to render the underlying Hebrew literally enough. So frequently you'll miss it. But the classic text, certainly referred to time and again in the Church Fathers, and again, actually often referred to in the Reformation and debates between Catholics and Protestants, is Daniel chapter 4. I think it's verse 24. I'm a little bit embarrassed here. The English
We'll take chapters. That's fine.
Okay. The reason why I'm a little embarrassed is the English and the Hebrew versification differ. So in one version, I know it's verse 24. The other, it's verse 27. So it depends on what you're looking at. But it's a famous text in which Daniel is exhorting King Nebuchadnezzar to enact penitential actions for his sins. And he tells them that he can forgive his sins through charitable actions. So there you clearly have the notion that charitable actions presumably pay down the debts that King Nebuchadnezzar has accrued. We also can find this notion in Leviticus 26, which talks about how Israel can repay the sins that she's accrued that have led to the exile. Again, I'm not sure most English translations are going to render it exactly, but the idiom, the underlying Hebrew idiom there, is clearly paying down a debt. And Isaiah 40, the very famous text many Bible readers know, that begins, comfort ye, my people," the text in which God exhorts the prophet to comfort the people of Israel who are in exile, who are about to be redeemed from exile. And a couple of verses in, he says that they are to be comforted because their sins, that is, understood, the debts of their sins, have been paid off, have been satisfied. So those would probably be the classic biblical texts. Most of them, according to modern biblical scholars, would be datable to the Second Temple period, that is the 5th, 4th, and even 3rd centuries before the Common Era. So we're near the end of the biblical period. If you really wanted to see a more robust use of the notion of the debt metaphor, you have to look at either the intertestamental books, the apocryphal books, or what Catholics would call the deuterocanonical books, Dead Sea Scrolls, or even best, the Mishnah, the rabbinic texts that would be contemporaneous with Jesus.
Tobit and Sirach are two of the deuterocanonical books, right, that you're talking about?
Exactly, and they're excellent sources for the imagery.
When we move into the New Testament, like you say, is there any question in what we have from Christ himself that he is there any sense at all that he deviates from this understanding of sin and charity? Does he deepen it? Does he change? Is there any alteration at all, or does he really just pick it up and move it forward?
There obviously are notes that he sounds that are distinctive to his own preaching, but much of the imagery that's found in the parables, you can find almost all of it in contemporary Jewish sources. I think he's very much dependent on a kind of standard mode of understanding charitable actions that was at home in the synagogue, and I think that's probably the best way also to understand the church's implementation of charity in the post-New Testament era. I think that both church and synagogue were very similar in the way in which this charity was enacted within them. In fact, scholars who follow, for example, Jewish and Christian charitable practices in medieval Spain have documented, considerable linguistic interchange between Latin and Hebrew, quite striking. And why would that be the case? Why would Latin phrases come into Hebrew, for example, in Jewish documents? Well, they came into Jewish documents because, the underlying theology was so similar.
We come out of the time of Christ's life. We're in the time of the early church fathers. Who among them picks up the concept of charity, acts of charity, as a way to atone for sin, for debts accumulated? Who would be the key figures here, and what do they have to say to us?
Well, I think the key there. I mean, I don't think you could really identify key figures. It becomes really the heritage, as it were, of the patrimony, really, of all the church fathers going forward. And scholars of late antiquity have certainly documented this. One of the ways in which you can really see the effect of Christian practices is the imprint it makes on the Latin and Greek language. Paul Vane, a very famous non-Christian, I'm presuming an atheist scholar of this period, not in spite of his own religious predilections, mentioned in his very famous book, Bread and Circuses, on generosity in the Roman era, that words like hospital, orphanage, poorhouses, these are all what he would call neologisms in Byzantine, Greek, and Latin that arise as the result of the development of these institutions by Christians. I guess if you wanted a contemporary example, if you looked at words for computer hardware and software in European languages, you'd notice that a lot of them are simply English words that have been borrowed into French, German, Italian, what have you. And if you were living 1,000 years from now, if you notice that datum, you would know that computer technology must have begun in an English-speaking country, or that must have been the heart and soul of the dissemination of computer technology. The language borrowing gives that away. And you could say the same thing. That's essentially what Paul Vane says. You can look at the language of contemporary Greek and Latin, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, and see objective evidence that, Christian attitudes towards the poor have made an enormous imprint on Greco-Roman culture.
Charity becomes, as you say, the common patrimony of the church in terms of its in practice, acts of charity, and we get these completely new institutions. Which I'm glad you touched on that, because it's important for people to know that there was no such thing as a hospital or an orphanage, essentially prior to the Christian period. But does the theology of charity, though, does that get further developed by any of the early church fathers? Is there, again, in the sense of I'm trying to kind of lead us towards whether there's any sort of controversy over how we are to understand charity's place theologically in the Christian tradition, or the church fathers sort of won on this?
So the fathers are pretty much of one mind on this. I guess I would want to say one thing. What the theological question, I think, is crucial. So why did charity become
Mm-hmm.
such a significant virtue, we might want to say, in Christian practice? And here, this is maybe the biggest surprise, perhaps for me, and I think the biggest surprise for many moderns. I think modern people tend to evaluate. Well, I'm going to get to there are a couple things I want to say. Modern
Sure.
people tend to evaluate charity, I would say, on two different grids. One on self-interest as opposed to altruistic giving, and the other grid would be what it accomplishes, with respect to the domain of social justice. What
Mm-hmm.
concrete change does it introduce into the culture at large? Now, let me just give a footnote to the second one. I think it's very important to mention, the institutions of hospitals, orphanages, and so forth into the equation, because in modern discourse, you'll find many people criticizing the concept of Christian charity because they reduce it to an individual in December dropping coins into a Salvation Army bucket. Now, I don't have anything against dropping coins into a Salvation Army bucket. That's a good thing to do. But I think what you'll find, especially in Marxist-oriented, criticism, is that Christians aren't really interested in addressing social injustices. All they want to do is ease their guilty conscience about, the wealth they possess. And I think when we look again at this evidence that Paul Vane collects, we can see that's decidedly not the case. What Christians were very interested in doing from the very get-go was creating institutions that addressed structural problems. Now, they were also interested in the individual virtues of giving, to be sure. They weren't opposed to that, but they were also deeply invested in what moderns would say are, concerns for social justice. So I think that needs to be, strongly emphasized, that charity and social justice are not, in opposition here. But going back to the theological point, the more important point here, I mentioned the altruism issue. The problem with modern assessments of charity, we might want to say in terms of how Christians understood it, is that they're all, what I would say, located on the horizontal plane. They're all concerned with the way in which one human interacts with another human. Whereas what struck Jews and Christians about charity is that these actions had a sacramental character to them, by which I mean they connected you to God. And that's what really made them so tremendously significant. They weren't simply helping another, they were that, but they were that and far more. They were, through helping another, the way of worshiping, adoring, and loving God. And that's the huge element, I think, that's often missed. And that explains why within the early church, charitable actions had the extraordinary value they did, and why they drove the creation of these extraordinary institutions that didn't have any parallels in Greco-Roman culture.
Yeah, it's you're right that people try to divide those things as a sort of critics of Christianity or charity, and we see this in the modern period, going, certainly from the 1800s forward. But your point is that it was there's the verticality of the thinking of early Christians that promoted the larger sort of horizontality of charitable acts. That these weren't opposed to one another. They were completely intertwined. They're inextricable.
Exactly. And I mean, one of the striking ways this comes out, and it is related to monetary imagery, but one of the most important verses in the Bible for, nearly all the church fathers was a kind of surprising verse from the book of Proverbs, which reads,
Mm-hmm.
"He who is generous to the poor makes a loan to God, and God will repay him." So this notion that somehow being generous to the poor involves not only helping the poor person, but it's actually making a loan to God. Now, where does that come from? Well, that comes from a very important biblical law that we can see in the book of Exodus, in which, in order to guarantee the security of people without means, ancient Israelites were commanded to provide them with goods if they, food and shelter if they had none. And the way in which that food and shelter would be provided was in terms of a no interest loan. The idea there was
Mm-hmm.
to protect the dignity of the person who received these goods. The sense was that, they had fallen temporarily on hard luck, but once, circumstances turned to their betterment, they would eventually be able to repay. In other words, there was a concern for the dignity of the recipient, not simply to give, which sometimes can be a means of shaming.
Right.
The person has no means to support themselves, so you have to do that for them. The notion in biblical law was, yes, you have to support them, but at the same time you support them, you have to provide a means that in the future they can repay and enjoy their dignity. Well, of course, sometimes individuals couldn't repay,
Mm-hmm.
but this is where the God piece comes into question. According to biblical law, God would be the individual who would reward the giver in this instance. And why would God do that? Because God has a special interest, compassion, and concern for the poor, a special identity with the poor, what we might call the preferential option for the poor.
Right.
God loves everybody equally, but he loves the poor the best. And that's a very important notion, so that
Right.
when you are helping the poor, you're helping someone, who's a dear friend of God. And that's an enormous driver. That's certainly what's behind Matthew 25, when Jesus says that the last judgment, that the blessed will enter the kingdom of heaven because they fed Jesus when he was hungry. They clothed him when he was naked. They visited him when he was, sick. And according to Matthew 25, the individuals respond, "Well, we never saw you in any of
Right.
those positions." And then Jesus responds, "Well, whenever you did this to a poor person, you really did it for me." That goes back to a very deep biblical legal principle. You can find it already in the book
Mm.
of Exodus, that's linked to what we might call this preferential option to the poor, God's attachment, his special love for the poor, so that helping the poor person is a means of helping and adoring God.
It's interesting that as you were speaking there towards the beginning, you brought up this concept that there was a sensitivity to protecting the dignity of the recipient of charity, even in this biblical period in which that we're talking about, because one often gets the idea from reading sort of modern scholars that this is a specifically democratic idea, that protecting democratic dignity, the dignity of the democratic man it was sort of what was new about how to sort of do charity in the 1800s, 1900s, especially in America. So maybe that's not right. That we've had sort of this concept of protecting the dignity of the recipient, giving in such a way that dignity is protected for much, much longer than the last couple hundred years.
No, I think what we have here, I mean, I can tell just with my parents who are growing older, they're in their 90s, and sometimes they need help with,
Mm-hmm.
rituals related to the bathroom. And for them, that's a very embarrassing thing to have
Mm-hmm.
happen to them, to rely on other people for activities that they would much rather, do themselves. I mean, at one level, it's very generous for people to help them with toiletry, but it's also in some senses deeply shameful for the persons being helped. They would prefer to be able to do it themselves. And I think that in antiquity it was the same thing you might want to say with, receiving money. Yes, it was a generous thing to help someone out. But if the giving was all in one direction, this could be humiliating. One wanted, ideally to meet people on an equal plane, or at least have a semblance of equality. So giving was always constructed with the notion that somehow equality or reparation was in the picture. That you never gave with the intent, either intended or not, of humiliating the other.
Well, with that, we will go to a break and we will be right back and continue our discussion with Dr. Gary Anderson about charity and the biblical tradition. Okay, time for a practicality, and happy to have with us today Mark Diggs, who's a managing consultant in our direct response group here at American Philanthropic. How are you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great, Jeremy. Thanks a lot for having me.
It's great to have you here. Mark is a very experienced professional in direct response, which for the uninitiated means sort of direct mail and digital means of acquiring and cultivating and soliciting givers. And I have one question for you, Mark. I've heard you make this analogy, and so I want you to talk about it to our audience here. How is direct response fundraising like fishing from a riverbank?
That's a great question, and let me try to attempt to answer it. Well, the basic definition of direct response is that it's direct, meaning it's measurable, it's accountable. It always contains a call to action with a direct response component like a reply device and a landing page or even a phone number that helps the donor have a means where they can immediately respond. That's some of the science of direct response, but the metaphor or the analogy of fishing from the riverbank, that helps you understand kind of the art of direct response fundraising, and especially how it differs from other types of fundraising, like major gifts cultivation. So every river, it's always moving, right? And if we're along the bank, we're stationary. We cast our lines into the bank or from the bank into the water, and the water's constantly sliding by as it flows. And to me, this mirrors like the seasonality of direct response giving and just the cadence of it. So it's just a constant cadence, right? So the nature of smaller gifts is they derive from a different source in terms of budget than major gifts or legacy giving, right? So you're not giving out of your assets, you're giving out of really your monthly budget, and it's not just the monthly budget, but it's the discretionary portion of the monthly budget. So it's the money that's left over after you cover all of your expenses and you decide what you're saving for the month. It's what's left over. So that's the bucket you make impulse purchases out of. It's also the bucket that typically you give direct response gifts to. So this is grassroots fundraising. Lots of people involved, smaller gift amounts, right? So that has implications, for how you're gonna do your fundraising and how it's gonna differ from.
Well, what I like about your analogy is that it's a sort of like major gifts fundraising would be like hopping in the boat and going out hunting for the big fish.
Yeah, deep lake. Like those lakes they form by building dams, and you have those 400-foot. They've got some of those here out in South Carolina where I'm at. That deep cold water. Yep, and that's
right.
A deep well as opposed to like a moving river. So
right, and it has implications, as you were saying, when you think of direct response fundraising like this. It kind of just was flowing by. It's given out a monthly budget for people. So how does this impact, if you're a development professional, kind of your annual calendar, like how you plan your fundraising strategy?
Well, I mean, once the river flows by, that part of the river is never coming back. So that's the point to be made. In other words, that discretionary budget, it's going to get spent one way or another. And once it's spent, that's it. And then you move into the next month. So there's an opportunity cost to not covering seasons of the year, points of the year. And, I don't want to be like hard and fast about it in terms of rules of thumb, but the basic thought is try to cover those seasons and months that are going to be important to you. Many organizations are mailing multiple times a month or once a month. It's going to differ depending on your culture, your donor culture and your organization's culture. But generally speaking, you want to be out there with lines in the water, right? So So that has implications for like having your a fundraising plan. And what I try to do, we have clients that we've built direct response programs for from scratch. So they've not done direct response before. Maybe we have one client that they had maybe 2,000 donors when we started working with them. They've got 80,000 now, just 2 years later. So we've built up a direct response grassroots file for them. So the way we did that was we planned out a calendar for the whole year. And what we're really shooting for is, we have some evergreen offers that are running all the time, especially on the digital side. But we also have campaigns, and campaigns have a beginning and an end. So you launch a campaign, you get response from that campaign. Let's say it takes a month, 2 months, 3 months for that to all wind down, and you're constantly moving on to the next campaign. So what we're trying to do are build what I call pillars. So pillar offers. So a pillar offer is something that has some of the aspects of an evergreen offer, but only in the sense that you can come back to it a year later. So like an end of year campaign is a great example of that. Where, you've got that December 31st natural deadline. And that's another thing I want to say. It's like really the exclamation point I want to put on this is that you really want to drive towards urgency because of the nature of that flowing river. You've got to cast that line out, and it's got, the bait's got to be shiny, and it's got to be timely. And part of that timeliness is making the case for why give now? Why is it important right now? And you really got to make that case in order to earn that gift.
It's not a bad analogy, Mark. I admit it's pretty good.
Oh, I like it. I like thinking in terms of pictures. If pictures are powerful, and that's what I mean by like the art of fundraising. I like to feel it in terms of the picture that I have. And it really makes sense when it comes to the time and the effort. It's hard work. You've got to be out there. Fishing is hard work, and you've got to be out there in the morning, and you got to be out there in the evening. You got to be out there sometimes even midday.
Love it. Mark Diggs, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Jeremy, appreciate it.
All right, we are back with Professor Gary Anderson of the University of Notre Dame. We're talking about his book, Charity, The Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition, and about the concept, not just the book. There's so many things I want to ask you, Dr. Anderson. Let me just start here. In the biblical tradition, what counts as an act of charity? I think sometimes almsgiving gets sort of privileged in this conversation. That's maybe really what we're talking about, or only what we're talking about. Is that the case, or what all counts as an act of charity?
I think that almsgiving has a certain, we might want to say, priority or prestige, because almsgiving, when you're putting your own financial assets at risk, puts you at risk. So the way in which, money was conceived, or the accumulation of wealth was conceived in the ancient world, is not different than in the modern. I mean, why do people fund an IRA or a retirement account or what have you? Because they want to have, money when they no longer can work, when they become vulnerable. Language I can remember learning just as a little boy about why you should have, money in your savings account as the bank. You often would refer to that as a rainy day fund. In other words, should Lady Fortune not smile on you, but grimace, you wanted to have resources to get through, a difficult time. You fall sick, can't work, what have you. So certainly this was as well known in the ancient world as in the modern world, probably better appreciated there because there were not government agencies or anyone else to step in the breach. If your resources failed, you were out of luck. So giving to another from your own material goods, especially if it puts you at risk, was an especially valorous thing to do. You might want to say, the highest moral action one could take on part of another would be dying for them, martyrdom. But, most people, of course, don't have the occasion to become martyrs. But almsgiving was valued because everybody has the occasion, as it were, to put their own financial solvency at risk by helping someone else. So So almsgiving always had a certain prestige because in a sense it was, again, maybe use an English phrase, it was putting your money where your mouth is. You say you love the poor, you say you love God. Well, show me. Let's see, if you're really willing to take a risk on behalf of another. But as you indicated, in the Christian and Jewish realm, this wasn't the only way one could show charitable disposition toward another. Visiting the sick, visiting those in prison, burying the dead. All of these were, educating someone else. All of these were also extremely valuable and frequently had the value of, charitable actions themselves. But they never rose to the same, we might want to say, level of prestige because, I visit, a man regularly he's in his 80s now, not well, and not many people see him. I do it as a religious virtue. I do it also because I like the man. But, it doesn't, it costs me time, but it doesn't cost me in the same way as if I was to, give like, Mother Teresa all of my money to the poor,
Right.
and not even accept an endowment, as it were, for my religious order. That's just an act of trust in God and love for others that, is, in a sense, hard to wrap your head around.
It's a level of risk taking that's not present in the other act, as lovely as the other act is.
Exactly. It doesn't, the risk element isn't there. And that's, I think it's worth mentioning here. That's one of the reasons why Mother Teresa, of course, was so highly esteemed by so many people, because her act of charity toward the poor of Calcutta, really was a total self-giving. And her acts of mercy, of course, attracted, attention and admirers from around the world. And people did want to endow her and her mission, but she refused the money. She didn't want to be compromised by it, and it's extremely, commendable, but also very difficult to imitate.
While we're on the topic of Mother Teresa, you point out in your book that a couple of many well-known figures, but a couple that you point out by name, and Steven Pinker and Christopher Hitchens, were deeply repelled by Mother Teresa. Why was that? How did they misunderstand her and what she stood for to the vast majority of the world, seemingly?
Well, I think what they didn't like, this would go back to our charity, social justice issues, is that in her actions towards the poor of Calcutta, her concern was not to, let's say, organize the masses from below, to appeal to the Indian government to change, this policy or that, so that these structural inequities that were, rampant in Calcutta could be addressed and solved in a once and for all fashion. And in a sense, that criticism is not unreasonable if, one's charitable actions have in view, never have in view, let's put it, any kind of structural change within a culture. That certainly wouldn't be good. But on the other hand, it's, I think, completely wrong-headed to think that one's actions towards the suffering and the ill should be completely instrumental. This has had grave consequences in any number of areas. I know I work, or my wife works, as an advocate for the mentally ill. And one of the things you'll find, and this would be true for many, I think, domains of charity, people are willing to give lots of money to scientific research with the notion we're going to find that magic bullet, that pill that will eliminate all these symptoms, or they'll give to this or that, all of the things that are commendable. And I certainly am happy people give for them. But the hardest thing to raise money for is for people who just, sit day by day with these people and care for them.
Right.
Because it doesn't accomplish anything other than give meaning to their lives, but it's not immeasurable in the same way. And it's very hard to raise money for that kind of thing. And I think, the reason why it's hard to raise money for that type of thing is that we only value actions towards, the poor or the suffering that somehow can be measured in terms of solving, the underlying structural problem. But there are many things in life that just there's many moments of suffering that aren't amenable to that kind of grid. Visiting, staying with the sick or the elderly. I mean, yeah, I'd love to have a solution to Alzheimer's, but even if we had a solution to Alzheimer's, there still will be, grave suffering associated with the elderly. They still need someone to sit by them and be with them, and it will always be a virtue to do that. And it won't be a measurable, it won't be a solution to a problem. It'll be simply an accompaniment of those who suffer. And I think for Mother Teresa, that was her charism. Not everyone is, called to change society. Some people are called to simply be with those who suffer. And I think thought it was a gross travesty that, she would be so, strongly criticized by Pinker for this. And the other thing I guess I tried to say in my book is that why people, I think, valorized her, that is Mother Teresa, over Bill Gates, for example. And I have nothing against Bill Gates. He's obviously, the recent revelations with respect to Mr. Epstein, we won't go into that dimension, and his personal life. But if we just talk about his philanthropic efforts, I totally laud them. I think they're incredibly commendable. But it's also worth, paying attention to the fact that however many billions he gives away, he still has billions in reserve.
Right.
His day-to-day life is not impacted by his giving. And that's the big difference with Mother Teresa. That's why people, are so in awe of her, is that her daily life was completely transformed by her giving.
Right.
And that transformation is a witness to, the character of God, God's love for the world. And that, in the end, is what people really honor, respect, and stand in awe of. And I think we often don't take sufficient measure of that dimension of her actions.
Another criticism of sort of the charity, the Christian concept of charity, specifically Christian concepts of charity or Judeo-Christian, it's not only what you were just getting at, that it doesn't look enough at solving root problems, systemic issues, that if we could just get at those, we wouldn't have, any poverty anymore, and so on. But the other criticism is, and I guess this probably was leveled at Mother Teresa herself from time to time, is that it doesn't distinguish at all or enough between the so-called deserving and undeserving poor, which seems like to be a very modern concept. I think, at least in my own reading, that we sort of really start to get in the 19th century. Is there any sort of like distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor in the biblical period or in the biblical tradition?
Yes, there is. Already in the book of Tobit, he will refer to the righteous poor. So I think he distinguishes between, individuals who are poor, who are worthy of our charity, and those who are not. On the other, but I wouldn't want to push that too far. I think your underlying sensibility here is accurate. I think in the modern period, what happens is that element, that distinction, which we can find in classic Jewish and Christian sources, is magnified and perhaps given, a kind of urgency and importance that it doesn't have in antiquity. Because what happens in the early modern period, and you alluded to it, is this, this sense, somewhat, hubristic, we might want to say, that, given the right social policies, we could actually eliminate poverty. And so a lot of the kind of social engineering is geared towards, motivating the poor to get to work and distinguishing, the deserving from the undeserving. And yes, this becomes an enormous modern issue, and where you're actually extremely accurate when we witness that transformation, which really happens in the 17th century or so. We'll see a number of Christian writers come forward and argue against means testing. And what are their theological points for that? They say, well, Christian charitable actions are meant to mirror God's, unfathomable grace. And just as we receive grace from God, though we are undeserving of that grace, so when we, act graciously to others, we should give to other people, unreservedly, without, calculating their worthiness of receipt. But having said that, it would be inaccurate to say all Christian giving in the Byzantine, medieval, and early modern period was, didn't take into consideration deserving or undeserving. That wouldn't be accurate. But it certainly didn't attach the same kind of value judgment we see in the modern period. If you really wanted to see the difference, I've frequently mentioned this to students. I think if you look at any big American city, South Bend would be a good example, and you looked at where the churches come in order to fill in the gaps that, governmental support can't fill, you'll see with respect to the government that, giving is definitely grounded to a degree in deserving. There are many things that can throw you off social welfare rolls and make you a homeless person and, outside the boundary of governmental assistance. But if you look at homeless shelters, soup kitchens, those are non-governmental agencies, almost always run by churches, that provide, a place to sleep or a warm meal, irrespective of, what the moral character of the recipient is. And some people abuse that. There are people that show up.
Right.
My wife is at a soup kitchen. People show up in Cadillacs. They want to see what the soup is for the day to decide whether they're going to, enjoy it or not. But, the soup kitchen doesn't say, well, you can't have the soup because, you drove up in that car, or because you're looking at the type of soup. That's not the mode of giving that's on display there.
Yeah, it seems as if you adhere more closely to this traditional sort of conception of charity, you're willing to live with a lot more inefficiency than if you are more sort of an adherent to the modern concept of charity.
Exactly. And I think that's also very much behind, you might want to say, Mother Teresa. There's just a kind of gratuity to generosity that's not calculating its instrumental value. It's simply, grounded in the notion that one must give one's entire, life to the service of others and God.
Dr. Anderson, what do Protestant theologians think of all this, or what do they say about your work? Because it certainly we're getting into here a significant ecclesial difference, it seems to me, and at least the understanding of sort of the salvific efficacy of charity, and that it has any sort of salvific value. There's a sort of a different attitude often towards the poor that comes out in sort of the post-Reformation period, as you were alluding to. What do they say about all this?
There, certainly, if you read, material from the 16th, 17th century, and this was a big surprise to me when I wrote my book, there are extraordinary differences and disputes, not about the value of charitable actions. I mean, the Protestant Reformation is as committed as Catholics are to being good to the poor, but the mode of delivery, as well as the way in which it's construed theologically, differ considerably. I remember reading a very good book by Stephen Greenblatt, a scholar of Shakespeare at Harvard, called Hamlet and Purgatory, which is kind of a mistitled book because Hamlet is only the subject of the last chapter or two. Most of the book is about purgatory. And it was deeply illuminating to me because I had no idea how purgatory functioned in this period. It's still, of course, a classic, Catholic notion that's affirmed, but you might want to say in the daily piety of Catholics, the role of purgatory is completely different than what it was in the 16th and 17th centuries. And charitable actions in the Reformation were geared toward reducing time in purgatory. That's one of the reasons why they were so valuable. There's say a lot more about that. But in the modern era, I think notionally Catholics would still affirm that, but it doesn't constitute any longer in the modern period the kind of spinal column of Catholic piety. So in the modern period, because that is so different, the differences have I think many of the differences have become less pronounced. The question of purgatory and individuals' contribution to their safe escort to the world to come were all notions that were deeply opposed by the Protestant reformers. And that constituted an enormous battleground in the 16th century. In the modern period, I'd say if you wanted to see an ongoing, different sensibilities about Protestants and Catholics on this question, it would come down to the question of human meritorious activity, the degree to which human agency has any value in securing forgiveness from God. I think Catholics have a place, more of a place for human agency in general than Protestants do. And so the notion of charitable actions is somehow contributing in some substantial way to your salvation. That's an idea that's going to be more comfortable within a Catholic frame of reference, whereas Protestants would say charitable activity is rather the fruits that flow from one's salvation, one's establishment, one's salvation. And both you could find that Protestant sensibility within Catholic context as well. I don't want to overdraw the difference, but the difference still exists.
Well, let me close with one final question here. Assuming you've thought of this, maybe I'm sure you have. One doesn't do all this scholarship only for scholarship's sake. Typically, how would you hope, perhaps, that your works are recovering to sort of the tradition on charity would affect how, say, religious leaders in particular, maybe particularly within the Catholic Church, would preach and talk about, think about charity? What would your hope be there?
I think, the effect on me, I guess I would just extrapolate to what I would want fellow Catholic believers to appreciate is that, charitable actions are, we might want to say, at the very heart and center of what we would call the Christological mystery, that in giving to the poor and giving ourselves to the poor, putting, let's say, our own financial security at risk to help others is very much, what the Christological mystery is all about. And so that charitable actions become the expression of the Christian faith, our pedagogy, we might want to say, in the Christian faith. I think what I thought before I engaged in the research, I knew charity was important, but I always thought it was a kind of secondary, outflow from a primary, faith that was, secured independent of the charitable actions. But as I, dove into the literature, I saw that was an enormous misconstrual of the biblical legacy, that, charitable actions are, the very expression of the Christological mystery. And that's why, charitable actions were so much at the forefront of the early church's, actions.
Beautifully put. Dr. Gary Anderson from the University of Notre Dame, author of Charity, the Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition. Thank you for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Appreciated it very much. A wonderful stuff for everyone to think about. And we'll talk to you later. Thank you.
Thank you.